Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. If this is your first time tuning in, my name is Tommy Bayer, co-founder of the Aphantasia Network. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Gary Lupyan. Gary is a professor of psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he studies the effect of language on cognition and perception, as well as the evolution of language. Over the past several years, he has been working on understanding what differences in subjective experience, including imagery and inner speech, can tell us about the unity and diversity of human cognition. And I came across a paper recently written by Gary called Hidden Differences in Phenomenal Experience, and the link to that paper will be in the description below. And I wanted to start the conversation and frame it by reading the abstract of that paper. So just bear with me for a moment as I read that. In addition to the many easily observable differences between people, there are also differences in people's subjective experiences that are harder to observe and which, as a consequence, remain hidden. For example, people vary widely in how much visual imagery they experience, but those who cannot see in their mind's eye tend to assume everyone is like them. Those who can assume everyone else can as well. We argue that a study of such hidden phenomenal differences has much to teach cognitive science. Uncovering and describing this variation, a search for unknown unknowns, may help predict otherwise puzzling differences in human behavior. The very existence of certain differences can also act as a stress test for some cognitive theories. Finally, studying hidden phenomenal differences is the first step towards understanding what kinds of environments may mask or unmask links between phenomenal experiences and observable behavior. So, without any further ado, Gary, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Very excited to chat with you about this, and I very much resonate with the little abstract I read there. I think so many aphantasics, will go most of their life without even knowing that other people are visualizing, and so maybe let's kind of start it there. How did you get into this? How did this become a topic of interest of yours, and how do we go so long without knowing that there are big differences between people?
Yeah, and visual imagery is just one example. So there are a few percent of the population who have various forms of synesthesia, and their common experience is you find out about it in a psychology class or you read something online, and then there's this realization that, wait a minute, what isn't this just normal? Doesn't everyone see, for example, letters as having different colors? And remarkably, even cases where one would think that people would readily notice, so color blindness, most people, prior to there being standard tests that they do in many countries now in elementary school, vision screenings, most people would just go their whole lives not realizing that they see colors differently from other people. And that's very, very easy to objectively test. And yet, even a difference like that tends to remain masked more often than not. Yeah.
And is that because it's just not discussed? Is it just general lack of awareness? Why so long? Before these realizations?
Yeah. So this is one of the things that really fascinated us about this topic. In a way, the fact that something is masked is telling us, it's revealing that there might not be that big a behavioral consequence, at least in day-to-day life. And so with color blindness, people get by. Language helps to fill in the gap, right? Where you'd think that language, that this would show up, that people with various forms of color blindness would misname colors all the time. But you learn that grass is green, not just from your own experience, but also from language. And so even if grass appears to be the same color as a red traffic light, you call the grass green and you call the red traffic light red, and this difference remains, and you just assume that, well, that's just how it is. People call it this thing by this color and this thing by a different color, and it looks kind of similar to me, but hey, language is weird. And so it's telling us when these things remain masked, it's telling us that, okay, there might be some underlying robustness in the system. And so, for example, when it comes to visual imagery, we mentioned stress tests of logical theories. So one example is if there's a theory that says, okay, for mental rotation, for example, that's an imagistic kind of process. You have to engage in explicit visual imagery to do it. What does it mean to then find out that people who don't really have subjective visual imagery perform just fine on mental rotation, or certain kinds of visual working memory tests that, again, for most people, they have the experience of kind of holding this image in mind and during the delay, and as far as you know, that corresponds to what they're actually doing. But it turns out that there are multiple ways of doing these tests that don't rely on imagery in the same ways. And so if you're just looking at kind of the main effect, the time it takes, the accuracy, you might not find a difference. It doesn't mean that everyone is doing it in the same way.
Right. So the outcome can be the same, but the process or the method that people are using internally can be vastly different.
Yeah.
And interesting. How maybe let's rewind a little bit and talk about some of your work and your research and how this interest of yours got started.
Yeah. So for a while, and it's still at the center of my research program, I've been studying the effects of language on cognition. So what language does for us other than just helps communicate. How does language help us categorize? How does it affect our memory? And for a number of years, I also did work on effects of language on perception. How does hearing a word affect visual processing? So not really studying imagery directly, although in some studies we did look at, for example, correlations with points on the visual, the VVIQ, the vividness of visual imagery questionnaire, and finding some differences there. But through the years, I was struck by how people would seem to come at this question with different assumptions about the role of language in their kind of mental life, where for some people it was obvious that constant inner speech, of course language is part of it, of course important. I can't imagine thinking without language. And for other people, it seemed kind of peripheral, where people struggled to put their ideas into words, and they felt very much like they had to go through this translation process. And so if that's your experience, it seems likely that you're going to be a bit more skeptical about claims that language somehow importantly underlies cognition. And historically, you see this tension, and it's analogous to the tension historically that you've seen in the role of imagery in thinking, where to some people it seemed obvious, and to other people it seemed like this peripheral process. And so we ended up doing some work that after many years is now under review, where we sent out a survey to about 8,000 psychology researchers, psychology, cognitive neuroscience, sort of allied fields, asking them, among other things, so they completed an imagery questionnaire. They also completed a bunch of other validated questionnaires about tolerance for ambiguity, some creativity measures, and we related it to their publications, to their research networks, and to their stance on various scientific topics. And I can send you, maybe it'll paste it into the YouTube box. We have a little data dashboard where people can explore the data for themselves, at least some of the data. But yeah, we do find, for example, a link between not imagery for scenes and objects like the VVIQ measures, but spatial imagery in particular, and people's endorsement, for example, about the importance of mathematical models and their actual use of mathematical models in research, how important they think mathematical theory versus a verbal theory is in explaining some psychological behavioral phenomenon. Interestingly, the sort of more static imagery is go slightly in the other direction. So people who have more tend to think mathematical models are slightly less important. People who endorse more linguistic ways of thinking tend to think that, not that surprisingly, that language is more important to cognition. And these are researchers. So there's this link between people's subjective experience and what kinds of evidence, what kinds of theories they think make more sense. Of course, everyone is to a large extent constrained by data, but there are multiple interpretations even of the same data. And so it's been interesting to see how people's subjective experiences kind of nudge people in one direction or another when interpreting data.
Yeah. Super interesting, and we'll definitely put that link in the box below. I guess it's like a case of projecting kind of your experience or the way you interpret and perceive the world, onto kind of everything, and right. And it reminds me, that so many aphantasics, in our community and that I've spoken to over the years, like talk about how what basically, that even the language that other people use, things like picture this or imagine this, that they're interpreting those words differently. They're thinking of it more as metaphors or things like this. Like there's a disconnect even between the language people use and the interpretation of that language because of the difference in internal processing. And do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, so one of the things we've been studying also in the last few years is differences in word meanings between people. And so there's an interesting kind of tension in the research because on the one hand, I've argued in a series of papers that language helps to align our minds in a way that, such that in the absence of language, if you were to just depend on our, we have similar bodies, similar brains, and so we are constrained as humans to experience the world in certain ways. But there's a lot of variation, and people have, of course, different experiences, different bodies, different sensations. And so language, by virtue of using kind of forcing people to align on at least the core vocabulary, to learn, at least when it comes to things we have words for, a common set of categories, helps to bridge these divides and to kind of allow us to kind of mind meld almost, right, in a way that would be much more difficult in the absence of language. And yet, at the same time, there's lots of evidence that people talk past one another all the time. And often in a casual conversation, it's good enough. You don't need to have very good alignment. And so it's easy to assume that you're talking about the same thing, that you mean the same thing by a given word. But then if you kind of scratch a bit under the surface and you have people make different inferences, you see how similar are their patterns of inference, or you have them make similarity judgments, or even write out definitions of words. You find that it's not that everyone is different from everyone else, but it's that people kind of cluster into groups. So for example, a word like pressure, right, that has various senses. Some, pressure, more physical pressure, right? Pressure you apply, to a source of pressure, air pressure in tire. But there's also these social senses of pressure, pressuring someone to do something, compelling someone. And people are aware, of course, of English speakers of that this word has these various senses, but which ones come to mind first? Turns out that for maybe 60% of people, it's one senses, and for 40% of people, it's other senses. And often, given the context, it'll be clear, but in some cases, it may not be. And so people can diverge without necessarily realizing that, like, oh, they've diverged a little bit. And so even with language, for all the aligning work that it's doing, there's still lots of opportunities for people to kind of think they mean the same thing by a given word, like imagine, and it turns out that they don't.
Could be something very different. And I'm going to link. It's so interesting because when I describe aphantasia or bring it up to people, I always ask people to think of a horse. And what I find so fascinating is for people with imagery, they'll always describe a different variation of a horse. Some people will see in their mind's eye, a brown horse standing in a field. Some people will see, the white racehorse, on the track. And this is one of those things where, I say the same word, but there's completely different internal representations of that word,
Yeah.
Based on a person's individual experience. One of the funniest cases, I was at a university in Waterloo, Ontario, once giving, the spiel, and a student comes up to me afterwards and says, "Oh, all I can see is the Minecraft horse because I've been playing, Minecraft on the computer for the last week." And I find this so interesting because, for as a non-imager, as a non-visualizer, when I think horse, it's still just that the word, it's the concept horse. I know it can have all these different variations, but my mind doesn't necessarily go to a specific instance of a horse. It's still at the conceptual level.
Yeah.
And these are some interesting differences, I think, that between visualizers and non-visualizers, and even between people with imagery itself, is this concept that language can evoke different mental representations, even of simple words like horses, and how that the complexity of that must expand as the concepts get more complex and abstract. Because we see it even just with the simple ideas, of course.
Yeah. And so I know in other talks you've hosted, people have talked about the relationship between inner speech and imagery. So I watched through Julie Simner's very nice talk, and we find the same thing. But it's a common misconception that there's a kind of trade-off between inner speech and imagery. And in fact, there is a moderately about 0.4 correlation, positive correlation between vivid imagery and use of inner speech. So people who tend to have more vivid imagery also engage in more inner speech. And they don't really trade off in the way that some people think, because there are different ways of cueing visual images. So you could kind of cue in your mind a visual image using a word, and someone with more inner speech is more likely to do that. Or you could cue it, and this we have sort of a much less developed understanding of, kind of thinking in concepts and what that means precisely. But where you could imagine someone with fairly vivid imagery, with less inner speech, right, might be kind of coining more prototypical, more schematic. They're still visual, they're still conceptual representations, but they're not going to be as specific, as particular. And so in some work with a former postdoc in the lab, Hedy Roebuck, we developed a questionnaire, internal representations questionnaire, that tries to get at this. So there's a visual imagery factor that uses some of the standard questions about visual imagery, and then a kind of propensity to verbalize factor that focuses not just on inner speech, but, for example, the extent to which, when people are trying to remember something, so remember their last birthday party, they have the feeling that they cue their memories using kind of more sensory, more visual cues. So it brings to mind someone who was at that party, and that kind of leads to associations of where they were and so on. Or is it cued more verbally, kind of words as indices? And people do vary on this, such that people who tend to experience more inner speech, more of a running narrative, this to me is actually kind of a revelation of my own, where I thought my inner speech was fairly typical, and I discovered after collecting lots of this type of data that most people have quite a bit more than I do, and that lots and lots of people endorse questions that ask them about whether they have a constant verbal narrative, and that kind of sounds exhausting to me. But most people that we ask seem to, especially college students, I think younger people seem to have more of it. They're more, I don't know, socially concerned. They're revising past conversations they've recently had, and so on. But yeah, so this relationship between language and imagery is not quite what many people think. It's more subtle, and it raises this question of the people who are in one quadrant of this diagram, who less image, and also they report having not much inner speech, and they say things like, I think in concepts, I think in ideas. What is that exactly? So Hurlbert, who I think maybe, I don't know if you've spoken to him, Russ Hurlbert, who's done a lot of work on descriptive experience sampling, of probing people, what are they thinking of at this point in time, in what format does it seem to be? So he describes what he's called unsymbolized thinking. That kind of fits this pattern. The name is a bit misleading, but where it's thoughts that are particular, they're about specific content, but they don't seem to be expressed in any kind of perceptual mode or linguistic mode or sensory mode. And it's hard to talk this stuff, but lots of people independently report having these kinds of experiences, fairly common. And so we do need to understand what that's about. Yeah.
So very interesting. I have maybe a higher level question, which is, why do these individual differences in how we think and perceive the world, why do they exist?
Yeah, in that little paper on hidden differences, we make the point that this might seem circular, but that they exist because they can. That there are many ways in which our cognition is quite similar. So if you have people do low-level visual tasks, barring certain kind of, say, visual disorders, people are very, very similar to one another. You test 100 people, and you get 100 curves that some people might be slower, some people might be faster, but very similar looking curves. So it's not the case that anything you measure, you find these kinds of large differences. And the idea is that for things that that evolution and development has to get right for this whole system to work, it's going to place strong constraints on variation. And things that vary, in a way, are telling us that, well, not as important for the organism to be at a particular place on this continuum, right? And so, for example, certain kinds of variation, like pain tolerance. So people who don't experience pain, it's rare, and it's a devastating condition because it's obviously very maladaptive if you are not sensing that you just broke your leg. And so these things are going to be selected against and are going to be quite rare. Visual imagery could be like that, where it could be the case. It's really important to be able to really imagine things for retrieving memories, for forming certain kinds of memories. And if that were the case, there would probably be less variation than there appears to be. But if underlying it is this robust system that allows people to remember and make use of their memories, do all kinds of things, but just in a somewhat different way, then that variation can arise and exist in a stable way. There's nothing kind of removing it from the population.
And in a way, it might even be a population-wide advantage, because there is a diversity of thought, diversity of way of looking at problems, and that those individual differences in perception and cognition likely manifest in different behavioral different behavioral patterns and ways of solving problems, and that likely has net benefit outcome. If everyone was the same and seeing the same thing the same way, it would be a much less rich population.
Absolutely. And to the extent that humans specialize, and there's, we have a very rich behavioral repertoire compared to many animals. So there are all kinds of things that we can do. And this is, of course, more true now than it was, say, 50,000 years ago. So there are kind of niches for humans who are naturally good at various things, right, to kind of move into. And so I've made this argument for to help explain why personalities vary as they do, right? Why is it that you would think that oh, it would be evolutionarily advantageous for everyone to be kind of really conscientious, right? Or extroversion tends to be associated with lots of good things. So why isn't everyone more extroverted? Well, and the argument is that there are ways of being where introversion is an advantage, and you don't want the whole population to be introverted, but the kind of global optimum isn't. It is variation in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Is that why this matters? Like, why care about individual differences? Someone says, "Oh, so what? You have aphantasia, or so what? You have synesthesia. Why does this matter?"
Yeah, there are many ways of answering it. So I'm a basic scientist, and so even if it doesn't matter in terms of like solving specific applied problems, it's still very interesting to me to think about this kind of variation. And as mentioned earlier, it does feed into actual theories in cognitive science, where someone is trying to argue that this is the way, right, some aspect of human cognition works. This is the way vision memory works. And it turns out that well, maybe it only works this way for 90% of people. And the other 10%, it's not just noise. It's not just, who knows what happened with those 10%. No, there's a different way of doing it. You don't have to solve this kind of task in this way that your theory says everyone is doing it. And so a theory that doesn't accommodate for that variability is incomplete. But also, I think more, I guess, heuristic level, kind of understanding the underlying diversity of thinking, I feel like it's inherently valuable and helps us, I don't know, empathize with others. And this being the Aphantasia network, obviously the focus is on imagery, but I feel like this comes up in all kinds of domains, right? It comes up, we mentioned briefly in the paper, in thinking about differences in preferences, right? Where, food preferences, for example, I think our go-to way of thinking about food preferences is that, well, some people like something and other people don't. And we get lots of feedback on this, right? We know that most people like chocolate, but you're not surprised to learn, okay, some doesn't like chocolate. But another way of thinking about it is that it's not just a difference in preferences, but some people are actually perceptually experiencing the input in a fundamentally different way. And so I drink my coffee black. I don't put milk in it. And it's not because I have a higher tolerance for bitterness and I'm just, I'm just tough and I don't need to water it down. It doesn't really taste bitter to me. And we know that there is this kind of real primary variation in the perception of these bitterant compounds in coffee, where some people, many people are quite sensitive to them and other people are not. And so we are not actually having the same experience, and it's valuable to know about that. And so we also use the example of the dress.
I'm going to show it on screen. Or maybe do you want to set it up and then I'll throw it up. So you do the setup.
Oh yeah, so the dress is this image that broke the internet in 2015. And what's so remarkable about it is that now there are a few other examples, but at the time it was really the first time the science community went wild, right? The first time that people were looking at the same image and seeing it in fundamentally different ways in a stable way, where for most people, it couldn't really switch. Seeing the same thing as having different colors. And the vision science community, we know the mechanism behind it. What was so odd is that in every other case, it wasn't an individual difference of this kind. So there are cases where things go back and forth and it's ambiguous, and it's ambiguous, and you see it one way and then a minute later you see it the other way. And so you could experience both, where this is a fundamentally different phenomenon, where most people just experience it one way and think that someone else experiencing it another way is just crazy, because it's so clearly not ambiguous to an individual.
This is yeah, this I love this. So let's pause there, and for anyone watching in real time, I'm going to put it on the screen, and you just comment in the box there what color this dress is. So I'll just give you a second, and for me, I'll say very clearly that is gold and white. If you told me anything else, no, I don't see it. Let's see if anyone else has any other thoughts. Yeah, already we're coming in blue. Alice says it's blue. Not for me. What about you, Gary? What color is the dress?
Oh, it's white and gold, and I did have it switch on me one time, the first day, the morning after it came out, and I was looking at it on my phone in daylight, and I thought it loaded the wrong picture because it was suddenly blue and black, and then 30 seconds later, I looked at the same picture and it went back to white and gold, and that way. So I had that experience of it switching one time, and it just kind of chilled me. So
it's so fascinating, and it's a really great example because it's just right there. It's right in front of you. You can be looking at the same screen right next to somebody and not agree on what you're actually seeing with your eyes.
Yeah. And so if you're talking about, do you like this dress, right? Two people can disagree, and in that case, right, they're disagreeing about a different thing, right? They're not actually seeing it. They're seeing it as a fundamentally different thing. And it's very easy to compare notes in this case. And it raises this question of how many other such cases are there around us, right? Where if we took the time to compare notes, we might find that there's a diversity of experiences, but we often have no reason to. The cases of diversity of this sort with colors are legitimately rare because there are other cues in the environment that help to disambiguate it and help to align people experience. So if you saw this dress in the real world, there wouldn't be this kind of ambiguity. But there are many other cases where the ambiguity might exist in the real world, not just in the photograph.
Just while we're having fun with it, I've got two other examples, slightly different, but I think they really help illustrate the point that this is not it's not even just the visual. It's not just your eyes. This can impact all of your senses. So here's a little one. And if you're watching, you can comment what you hear when I play this.
Laurel, 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 Laurel.
One more time.
Laurel, Laurel.
So what did you hear in that video? You can add into the comment box. For me, I hear Laurel. Over and over and over. Cindy hears Yanny. So listening to the same audio clip, and everyone hears something different. Laurel, Yanny, Laurel, Yanny. So this is really powerful because it I think it helps that idea of sympathy, that other people might not be experiencing the world the same way you are, in a real, tangible, kind of perceptual way. And super fascinating. I want to transition a little bit to talk about how we measure these differences, because there's a classic challenge, which is, let's just use the VVIQ for example. It's a subjective questionnaire. People are, filling in a couple of bubbles, and vivid for me might not mean the same thing it means for you, because we can even loop it back to our earlier conversation about the meaning of language. So how do we meaningfully measure and talk about these differences if there is that subjective kind of layer in between, the data and the individual?
Yeah, so this is a really important question, and so there are a few different kind of directions here. One is to think about the importance of subjective experience in general, and I found it in conversations. One thing that's compelling is you point out other cases where clearly the subjective experience is what matters. So pain is an obvious example, right? What matters is, not some more objective physiological state, right? So often when we're in pain, our heart rate goes up. But if you have someone who says, I'm in a lot of pain, you measure their pulse is normal, you're not going to ignore their claim. Depression, it doesn't matter if someone's, you do a scan and depressed and non-depressed brain scans look a bit different. If someone has a depressed looking brain but they feel normal, that's what matters, and vice versa as well. Things like sexual attraction, right? So that often goes along with certain behavior, but there's also a subjective state, and that matters. That's part of your sexual orientation, right? So those kinds of examples often people generally find compelling, that, okay, yeah, the subjective experience in many cases is the primary phenomenon. But then there's the question of, okay, but is it the case? And I was just in a Twitter discussion over the last couple of days on with some colleagues on this topic about, are people actually having the same subjective experience but are just describing it differently? So is it a problem of communication? So you ask someone to imagine something, and the questionnaires, for example, depending on which one, though, they often ask, like, how similar is it to actually seeing it? And if someone thinks that imagery is just like seeing, they might say, well, no, it's someone who actually experiences, who's not aphantasic. It's not literally like seeing. There is a difference there. And so if they interpret the question like that, like there is a difference between actual visual hallucinations and visual imagery, subjective difference. So, you might have people who have in some ways the same subjective experience, but are interpreting the questions differently. And so that's why I think people often want to show that, no, there is something about these questions that's getting at something that's also linked to objective behavior, so to measurable differences in behavior. And so it's valuable, I think so, Joel Pearson has done some of this work, right, to show that you can find objective correlates of these subjective differences in responses, which you wouldn't expect if it's just people interpreting the questions in a different way. And there are ways of phrasing the questions badly that make it more likely that people who probably are people who have a similar experience are responding differently because of their different interpretations. Or in some cases, dreams are one of those where most people can't really confidently report on their dreams, but they have ideas about how they should respond. And so you get differences, but that are more likely to be due to differences in kind of people's theories about what dreams should be like and how they should answer these kinds of questions. And so in those cases, if all you have is a subjective report, there's reason to take it with a grain of salt.
Interesting. So there are maybe how do you think about maybe then distinguishing between the type of things that are, we can rely more heavily on subjective measures? Like where do we need more objectivity, and where is like the subjective description enough? Like how do we balance that or think about it when we're thinking these
things? I think for at least within psychology, cognitive science, it's generally the case that with these kinds of phenomena, for people who really start kind of taking it seriously, you want to show that it has, at least in some cases, some sort of objectively measurable consequence, right? And so it could be that in the real world, there aren't really differences in, say, memory, visual memory. But then in more controlled settings, in certain environments, right, you can show that, okay, there is a difference there, suggesting that people are able to compensate and produce, similar outcomes in the real world. But if you prevent people from using this compensatory strategies, and the populations dissociate, and say differences in visual imagery start mattering and being correlated with the outcome variable. And so, for example, with synesthesia, this happened, now maybe 10, 15 years ago, right, where for a long time, it was really just in the realm of subjective report. And then people did, and fairly straightforward experiments to show that, okay, people who, for example, have various color sound synesthesia, so they hear sounds when they see flashes of light, or vice versa, they hear sounds, they see them as having different colors. You can show that it hurts their performance in certain kinds of tasks, because the sounds induced by flashes are interfering with processing actual sound, or helps them in other tasks because it helps them remember a sequence of lights, where for non-synesthetes, they just experience it as lights. But for synesthetes, they can also experience it as a series of sounds, and so kind of remember it as a melody, something, right? And so provides an advantage. And, it might not have very big consequences in the real world, but you can show experimentally that, like, okay, this subjective report actually can be measured in other ways, right? You don't just have to rely on subjective report. And then you might go on, right? Actually, if you are studying synesthesia, just going in the end with subjective report, because it's much easier, and it's now been validated as predicting these objective differences.
And you pointed to something there around like compensations that people make in the real world for what these differences might be. And so is that how we think about some of these differences? Is it like a compensation when something is different, or say outside of the norm? Are they're compensating for that difference with
well,
another skill or another tactic, or how do we think about that piece?
Yeah, so compensating, I think, has an overly negative connotation, which I don't actually want to endorse. So one example that stuck with me, I was in a workshop 2016 that Joel Pearson was at, and he was presenting some work that was published a few years on the effects of visual imagery on visual working memory. So people have to remember a set of orientations, lines of different orientations. So they see those, there's a delay, and then they have to recreate all the orientations that they saw 15 seconds earlier. And most people with typical imagery tend to report that they're fairly accurate on this task. The more orientations you have to remember, the worse people get, of course. And they report, well, they kind of held that image in their mind's eye and then kind of consulted it. And people with aphantasia don't do this, right? They don't report as what they do, but their overall performance is pretty much exactly the same. And so they looked at differences in strategy and found that they reported using different strategies. And so again, that's just a subjective thing. But then it turned out that there was also a difference in how performance on this task related to performance on a different task that had people remember numbers, where in the general population, two tasks are not correlated. So remembering numbers and remembering orientations, not correlated. But in the aphantasia group, they were quite strongly correlated. Strategies people reported using for both tasks in the aphantasia group were also more similar. And so that's a kind of nice example of there isn't an overall effect, but something is different because these two tasks that are independent in one group are actually quite correlated in the other group, suggesting people are using more similar mechanisms. And the example that stuck with me was Joel was talking about how, when asked how people were doing it, some of the people with aphantasia said, well, they were using what one can think of as kinesthetic imagery. So they imagined what it would feel like to hold their hand in the different orientations. And I remember thinking, I could probably do that, but it would never occur to me that this is something anyone would do. And so people without aphantasia could probably learn to use this kind of strategy, but it would, I think, most people just not occur to them that that's a thing. And so in that case, you can think of it as compensation, right? But it's also just, it's a different way of doing it. So it's not that they are kind of, having to do more work to sort of get to the same point. It's just, hey, there's this other path that gets the job done. And whether it's better or worse depends on the situation. Like if you're actually, actively moving your hand or something, and your hands are occupied, then okay, that's not going to work as well, right? But in other cases, it might be more effective. So another example of this is there are a variety of ways that people approach mental arithmetic. So how you're taught to add or multiply does matter, but people develop all kinds of diverse and sometimes quite idiosyncratic strategies of doing mental arithmetic. And one thing that we've noticed is, this is quite rare, but it's not just a single person, teeth drumming. So people talk about a few people using their teeth, kind of tapping their teeth to help them, remember kind of where they are in the problem, carry the one, so on. And this is not something that you would ever ordinarily talk about to other people. They probably don't think everyone does it, but it just doesn't occur to them to question whether this thing is odd, right? And so one straightforward prediction is, if you brought people who do this into the lab and you have them do mental arithmetic while they have a pen in their mouth or while they're chewing, right, you'd probably find that it disrupts their performance. And if you didn't know about this, this would be completely nonsensical. Like, why would having a pen in your mouth make a difference, right? But this would also be a nice, no one has done this as far as I know, this kind of experiment. It would be a nice way of validating this otherwise subjective report with an objective measure that, like, okay, they're not just totally confabulating it. No, you can show that it actually matters in accuracy, reaction time, and so on.
I really like this, because that compensation word gets thrown around a lot, but it's not that necessarily more work is going on. So compensation maybe has the wrong connotation. It's just a different approach from the beginning. Yeah. Most of the time when you're even unaware of that, you're, because for most in the aphantasia context, most people don't discover until later in life. And so they've already discovered a way to solve that problem, not knowing that they're, doing it differently, than others might be. So.
Yeah, and one example of this, and I would love, I don't know how many people are tuned in, I'd love to hear from folks about this. So I can't draw. I have fairly vivid imagery, but so I can imagine something in a lot of detail, but I just don't have like the motor skills to actually draw it. And so the idea that people without visual imagery can draw from memory, which, I mean, there are some differences. Wilma Bainbridge's work on this. There are some differences, but it's striking, like how good drawing, to me, how good the drawings can be. And it seems that the approach is different. There's a lot to learn about what's happening there. There is someone pointed me in this direction. There's a site. It's a series of drawing tutorials, drawabox.com. And the guy who runs it has a video. He discovered at some point that he has aphantasia, and he's a professional illustrator and draws these kind of like video games and science fiction type landscapes. So he's not drawing from memory, but he's drawing from his imagination without kind of having anything visual in his mind, so to speak. And so he describes kind of the strategies developed, and so he teaches this as a way of teaching people, all kinds of people, to draw. And so here it's an example of strategies that probably wouldn't have come about from someone who is drawing from memory using visual imagery, and ways of approaching this task that's different, and probably can result in drawings that that are original in actually different ways as a result. And so yes, talking about it as compensation is a I feel a bit odd about it. Yeah.
Really, really great stuff. We've got a couple questions coming in here, so maybe we'll jump to a few of those. If there's any more that you'd like to ask Gary, just drop them in the chat there. Scott, okay, I'm going to go first to Scott here. So this may be beyond your research, Gary, but I'm going to ask anyways. There's a two-parter. Let's see, the way language separates humans from the rest of the animal world. Do mammals and other animals visualize? Do they have aphantasia? So we say that. So I'll try and summarize. We say that language separates humans from the rest of mammals. Do you know if there's any work on visualization or imagery in other mammals?
Yeah, so this gets into this question of measurement, where it's really hard to have a measure that's subjective, that you use in an animal that doesn't have language, that can't talk about it. So there's a lot of work on visual, for example, visual working memory in all kinds of animals. And they perform the tasks in many of the same ways that humans do, but there's no way, the current measures, as far as I know, don't allow us to distinguish, to really gain any insight into the subjective experience of the animal. So if it has to remember something, hold it in memory, and then match, this image or this image, train the animal, they do it correctly. You can use various electrophysiological techniques to understand this is what these experiments are generally run for, understand the neural coding of these visual memories. And there's a lot of similarity between that and human visual memory. But it's often in this work, right, you test a handful of animals. And so if there's some difference that might affect 5 or 10%, you probably wouldn't know. You're not testing enough of them to be able to difference. And you're not really getting into the subjective experience. There is actually one way that one method that might allow us to do this. So in addition to measuring accuracy, you can also measure confidence. And people vary on this in interesting ways, where if you give people some difficult perceptual task, you have their actual accuracy, but you can also ask them to indicate, okay, how do you think you got this right or not? And for some people, these metacognitive judgments are quite accurate. So when they say you're not really sure, they tend to be, they're more likely to be wrong. And when they say, yeah, I got it right, they tend to be right. But then in other people, their actual accuracy is totally normal, but their metacognitive judgments are not tracking their accuracy. And those kinds of tasks can be done with other animals. You can train an animal to kind of make this sort of, in these tricky ways, metacognitive judgments. And so that's a way of kind of gaining some insight into subjective experience. I don't know if anyone used that to probe visual imagery, but that would be one way of kind of getting at this. It's really hard without language.
Yeah, but what's very interesting what you said is that there does seem to be ways to show individual differences even in other mammals. It's not just like a human thing, but a mammal thing more broadly.
Mhm.
Super, super interesting. Any other? Okay, we got another question here from Jenny. When measuring subjective experiences using self-report, are there any do's and don'ts to help mitigate interpretation errors in language? Are there any kind of like maybe high-level rules that or thoughts on accurately capturing subjective experience?
Yeah, it's hard to answer this in the abstract, but examples certainly help. So in one of these recent conversations I had, I was talking to someone who seems like, has less visual imagery, but talks about, well, that his visual imagery is much worse than his auditory imagery. And he was having trouble, again, kind of committing this this tendency to assume that, well, everyone is like that as well. Like that's just how human experience is. Where when thinking about music, for example, he can pick out the different instruments, appreciate the timbre of different instruments, and it's just nothing like that in vision. And I was saying that, well, for me, it's kind of the opposite. Visual imagery for me is more vivid than auditory imagery, so it doesn't have to be this way. But it helps in that case to draw, for him to sort of appreciate what vividness in visual imagery is through an analogy to vividness in auditory imagery. And so it would be hard to work that into a survey where everyone is seeing the very same instructions and questions. But this kind of way of contextualizing it to kind of appreciate, because someone, for example, and who, it understandably, the word vividness is sort of problematic, right? Like what does vivid really mean for someone who doesn't experience visual imagery, because it's not the same really. And I know those, like the apple, the horse, right? I don't feel like it may be the best we can do, but it's not really the same as just seeing something through fog. Right? Because you're not actually, when you're imagining something, generally, you're not actually seeing it kind of floating in space in front of you alongside with the things that you are seeing. And so if the question somehow suggests that that's what imagery is, you might get everyone saying like, well, they don't have it. But in developing surveys, you generally want to see, for example, if it's the case that for some people, let's say you have questions 1 and 2, and in 80% of people really strongly correlate, and in 20% of people they don't. Chances are that those people are interpreting those questions differently. And so you want to do this sort of item analysis, and there are formal techniques for it to make sure that the questions, people can answer the questions differently. You want people to answer the questions differently, but the relationship among questions should ideally kind of cohere to if people are understanding them in the same way.
There's something, just a couple questions on the top of my head, specifically around your work around kind of language and cognition. One of the confusions I think that comes up a lot in some of the conversations I have is the difference between inner speech and auditory imagery and self-talk, this whole kind of inner world when it comes to how language is experienced. So for example, if I think of a famous saying that my dad said growing up, I can remember what those words were and I can rehearse it in my voice. I can internally sub-vocalize it, but I don't hear the sound of his voice saying those words. And so am I thinking about the difference between inner speech and auditory imagery correct in that kind of analogy? Or do you have any insight on that?
Yeah. So with inner speech, I think it's fair to say that it's a type of imagery. It's not always auditory. So there's a difference between what's been called heard speech and articulated speech or produced speech. So most people experience inner speech auditorily, but for some people it's and usually in their voice, but for some people it's more of a kind of a motor experience of saying it without really the auditory element, and so it's sort of produced speech. We find that if you ask people, do they hear a voice when they read silently, that tends to be fairly strongly correlated with their experience of inner speech in other domains. So in that case, it's not the actual content is coming from the thing you're reading. You're not producing it yourself, but having that auditory experience in that case. So people who say, yeah, all the time, they tend to also be more likely to report that they have, kind of internal monologue a lot of the time, that they have a commentary. It's also the case that the more they endorse this, the harder on average, the harder a time they report having in shutting it down, right? And so someone who has less inner speech, on average, they tend to be able to shut it down more. Intuitively, there's less to turn off in a way. When it comes to music, musical imagery is correlated with inner speech, but you have people who say they don't really experience inner speech much, but they can imagine a song, they can kind of replay a song or a voice, singing voice, in their head. Earworms is another interesting thing where they're less likely to report experiencing having a song stuck in their head, earworms, but they still do, just to a lesser extent. One interesting thing is that the shape of the distribution of variance in inner speech looks almost identical to variance in visual imagery. It's sort of this right-skewed distribution with a lot of people kind of on a 1 to 5 scale, a lot of people clustered around the 4, and then sort of a long tail, so 1s and 2s. So you see that for inner speech as well as visual imagery.
Interesting. I'm going to get a couple comments here I'm going to throw up. Okay, I simply cannot comprehend any inner voice or speech. I simply think. David, so this is an interesting one. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, and so in this early, right, that David, you're not the only one who's said this. So we have people saying that, I think in ideas, I think in concepts, and this is in some ways atypical. Most people don't say this when asked to talk about what their thinking is like, but it's a thing, and we need to understand it. And so one question is, to what extent is this way of thinking more spatial than it is in most other people? As folks probably know, kind of visual imagery of faces, places, is somewhat separable from spatial imagery. And people who have aphantasia have fairly typical spatial imagery according to both subjective questionnaires and various spatial imagery type tests. And so could it be that spatial imagery, spatial cognition are involved in thinking in people who also have not much or no inner speech? It's something we need to understand better.
I got maybe one last question or topic, and then we'll wrap it up if there's no other questions. One of the unique things I think that's come out of the proliferation of aphantasia awareness is this metacognition that comes with it. It's this thinking about your own thinking. And it's not just for those who experience aphantasia. So many people you talk to, I've talked to personally about it, really reflect on their own kind of imagery experience and how it impacts their life, because they're just learning for the first time that it's possible to exist without that thing that they rely on every day. And so do you think how would you think about the personal advantages or disadvantages of that metacognition of individual differences? Because it cuts both ways. There are also people who learn that maybe they're different from the crowd and feel that they're at a disadvantage, or that they wish that they could do it the same way somebody else does. So how do we square that relationship between individual differences and this knowing that maybe you're different from everybody else in one of these many domains?
Yeah, so I think the fact of the variation, as I said before, the fact that it exists sort of tells us that it's probably not, devastating wherever you are, right? It doesn't matter hugely for kind of day-to-day things. It doesn't mean that it doesn't matter at the margins. So, for example, with inner speech, it'd be that if you are a novelist trying to write like realistic dialogue, if you don't have speech, that would be pretty hard. And if that's your goal and you find yourself just really struggling, it could be that you do a really, really good job, right? Inner speech is really helpful. Or with visual arts, that you can with Aphantasia can draw from memory, but it's at the margin it's hard. It's probably harder. And so there are probably certain pursuits that are relatively easier and difficult. You do find that in mathematics, people on average have less visual imagery, somewhat higher spatial imagery, and so that's kind of interesting. And so knowing yourself, right, can be valuable in that way to kind of maximize the use of your skills and talents. But yeah, I mean, from personal experience, switching to inner speech briefly, like I've personally never been interested in meditation, and I hear like it really helps lots of people, and I've wondered, like, is it because I have less inner speech than a lot of people, and so there's not that much to shut off, and so people's the need to practice certain mindfulness exercises to kind of shut off inner speech, that could indeed be valuable to many people, but it doesn't mean that I am missing something. It could be just not not something that I need. And so kind of knowing where you are on these dimensions of variation, I think, can help in this way. Somewhat similar to people get a lot, some people especially, out of taking personality tests and kind of feeling some validation in understanding that, okay, that there's this variation, and here's where I am on it. And you have to think about, like, how much do I want to, if I'm more introverted, really work at being more extroverted, when to other people this is just their natural state, how it is, versus being fine with the way I am, embracing the niche that introversion is good for, right? So yeah, kind of knowing yourself.
Yeah, I love that know thyself, and it's one of the reasons why I think that this work is so important. There are unknown, like you write in the paper, unknown unknowns. There are, I'm sure, many differences that we just have yet to discover or articulate, and that I think that's where the metacognition piece comes in. The more we understand about ourselves and how these individual differences play out in the real world, in terms of our strengths, things that it may enable in us, or niches that we may be better suited to. I think there's great work to be done in this, and this conversation is a good piece of it. So thank you so much for joining us, Gary. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's fun.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining in, and we will cut it there. Bye-bye.